All right, this video is going to be kind of a more detailed look at some of the tools that you can use to remove and install bearings in a Santa Cruz full suspension bike. So these linkages happen to be from a Santa Cruz 5010 or Solo, but pretty much all full suspension Santa Cruz frames will have similar links. I think the Bronson uses the exact same links as the 5010. And even if the links are a little bit different, I think the bearings are all pretty much the same. So to remove the bearings, there's a couple ways you can do this. I've seen videos where people have just kind of stuck a punch through and then used a punch and a hammer to pop them out. And that works, but it's not the best way to do it, I would say. And not a way that I was really comfortable doing. So I actually bought tools from Santa Cruz. You can buy these on their website. And I guess you could say these are somewhat expensive. They were about $50. But the way I looked at it was if you have a Santa Cruz frame, even if you bought it secondhand, chances are that you spent quite a bit of money on it. So spending a little bit of money on the proper tools to work on it, I think is a wise thing to do. And this tool, for example, is used to remove these larger bearings, which is what is in the lower link, and then there's 2 in the upper link. So there's 6 of those bearings total. So even if you only change bearings in your frame once, you end up using this tool 6 times. So it's not like something that you're going to buy once and then never use again. But anyway, how this works is there's these 2 halves here that get spread apart by this pin, just like that. So when the bearing is in the link, you put kind of the small side of this tool through the bearing like this, and then put in this pin from the other side, and then that spreads these apart, and then it holds them apart, and then these little hooks here hook on the inner race of the bearing, so that when you hit on this pin with a hammer, that just drives the bearing out of the link. So these actually work really well. And the other nice thing about these is that if your bearings are in pretty poor condition, or if this just happens when you go to remove them, if the inner race happens to pull out and all the ball bearings then fall out, and you're just left with the outer race being stuck in the link, you can still use this tool to remove that. And what you do is you flip it around to this other side with these larger hooks, and you just use it the same way, but then these larger hooks will catch on just the outer race if that happens to still be stuck in the link. So that's kind of a nice feature that they put on this tool, is that you can still remove the outer race if it happens to get stuck. I've changed bearings in my frame once so far. I'll be doing them again here shortly. And the first time I did it, I did not have that happen to me. All the bearings came out intact. But in case they don't, you can still use these tools. Now, I did buy the smaller version of that same tool to do the smaller bearings. There's 2 smaller bearings in the upper link here. And it's the same thing, works the same way. But for whatever reason, the smaller bearings in my upper link, they were really tight. So I had to pound on this pin quite a few times, and I had to pound on it pretty hard. And so hard, in fact, that it might be hard to see in the video, but the shoulder that hits against these 2 split pieces, it's actually flared out a little bit because I had to pound on it so hard to get them removed. And I did eventually get them out, but they were really tight for some reason. I don't know, maybe just the bore for the bearing in the link was machined to the smaller side of the tolerance. So maybe it was a tighter fit than normal, but whatever the reason was, they were pretty tight, and I thought I could probably come up with another way to do it. So I ended up making kind of my own tool to remove these smaller bearings. And the reason I was able to do that is because with these smaller bearings, you can actually access the inside of the bearing. Unlike these larger bearings, the material of the link is in here, so you can't get any tools inside. But on these smaller bearings, you can. So what I did was I just machined this little insert bushing piece out of brass, and it goes on the inside of the bearing, and the diameter of this is just a little bit smaller than the diameter in the link because it actually has to pass through the link. But that goes in the bearing like this. And then I also machined this little cup piece, and then I put a piece of rubber on the face of it because this goes on the outside of the link, and it actually touches the link. So I put that piece of rubber on there just so it wouldn't mark it up, even though it is just brass. But that goes on the outside, and then I just use a piece of threaded rod that goes through both of those. Then just put a nut on the inside, and then also put a nut on the outside, and then run that nut down. As you tighten the nuts together, then that will pull the bearing out of the link, and then the bearing will just kind of drop into this cup. And again, I'll link to the video where I actually show removing these. But this works, it works really well, and I like doing it this way a lot better than using that other style of tool, because you don't have to hit on the pin with a hammer, and especially because mine seem to fit extra tight for some reason. With this style, you just tighten the wrenches and it'll pull the bearings out. And you could do something similar without having to machine little pieces like I did. For this cup piece, for instance, if you found a large socket that was about the right size, you could use that. Again, you'd probably want to put something in between so it wouldn't mark up the face of the link. So you could use a socket on the outside, and then instead of this piece, you could use maybe a small socket or just a couple small washers or something like that. And then just a piece of threaded rod or even a bolt and a nut. So there's other ways that you could accomplish that. And I think you can buy tools similar to what I made also, if you wanted to go that route. But these work pretty well for removing these smaller bearings. Again, you're able to do that because you actually can access the inside of the bearing here. So that's about it for removing the bearings. For installing the bearings, I actually use the same threaded rod and nuts that I used to remove the smaller bearings from the upper link, and then just have these machined pieces that the bearings fit on. These go on the link, and then you actually press in two bearings at once, so you kind of install them in pairs. So you would have a second bearing like this, and then just put on the nuts and tighten them, and then the bearings will just get drawn into the link as you tighten these bearings. So pretty simple and straightforward. And then these, of course, are just for the smaller bearings in the upper link. But you can buy a tool like this from Santa Cruz as well. It's pretty cheap. I think it's like $20. And you get a piece of threaded rod and nuts, and then I think you get both sizes here, pieces for both sizes of bearing. And I was actually just going to buy that tool rather than making my own, but they were out of stock when I needed it, so that's why I just ended up making my own. It was easy enough for me to do, but that's pretty simple and straightforward to install them. The only difference I'll say is that for the smaller bearings, that go in the upper link. Again, since there isn't material directly between these bearings, I also made just a spacer piece that fits in there, and that just kind of guarantees that there's no risk of the sides of this link trying to bend as you tighten these bearings in. I don't think it's a real concern to begin with, but I just feel better about having something in between here, so there's just absolutely no chance that something could happen to this link. And maybe that's because the bearings in mine seem to fit kind of extra tight. So I thought, well, when I go to install them, if they're harder to press in than normal, I just wanted something in between here, just to make sure that this link wouldn't get tweaked or anything like that. And as far as I know, if you buy the tool from Santa Cruz, it doesn't come with a spacer like this, but you could easily kind of make your own. You could just use like a big stack of washers to go in there, or find a piece of pipe or tubing that's about the right size and then just cut it to be the right length. But I just think it's a good idea to have something in there and just kind of feel better about it. And as far as this installation tool, there's a lot of ways that you could do this, and different things you could use. One common thing to use when installing bearings, I think, is to find a socket that's about the same size as the outer race of the bearing, and use that. If you have a bench vise, you could just even use the bench vise to squeeze the bearings into the link. You'd still need to use a socket or something, because these bearings are recessed a little bit from the face of the link. So if you just used a vise to press them in, they would only press in to where they were flush with this face. So you'll still need to use a socket or something to get the bearings to go down as far as they need to. But you could do that. You could use a piece of threaded rod, like I did, but just with some sockets or maybe some washers that are about the right size. Lots of different ways you could do it. I've even thought about 3D printing pieces like this. I know that 3D printers have gotten really affordable these days. So if you know someone that has one, or if you have one yourself, you could try 3D printing some pieces like this. Maybe 3D printing them just solid plastic, so no honeycomb structure or anything on the inside. And those might be strong enough, depending on the type of material it is. But no guarantees on that. That's something you'd have to try out. But that's another thing to think about, though, as an option. I will just say, if you are just using something a little bit more simple and not these nice tight-fitting machined pieces, just be careful when the bearings first start to press into the link. If you just have a bolt and a nut and some sockets or something, just make sure that these bearings are starting in nice and straight and square, and they're not going in crooked and starting to bind. So just use a little bit of caution if you're doing it with some more rudimentary tools. Just make sure that they start in straight. Once they start to press in, they should go pretty easily. The other thing that I do, and have done with other bearings too, is I'll put the bearings in the freezer, usually the night before I go to install them. That way they're nice and chilled, and then they do end up shrinking just a little bit, and that makes it just a bit easier. Although these are so small that it doesn't take long for them to warm back up to room temperature, and it helps a little bit, but definitely not necessary. So I think that's about it as far as these tools go. I'll link to the shorter videos that I did where I actually show using these tools to remove and install the bearings. But I just wanted to kind of give a more detailed look at these tools and how they work, and a little bit about my experiences with the tools too. Like how that one tool, it was pretty difficult to remove these smaller bearings, so I ended up kind of doing my own thing there. But if you have any comments or questions about these tools, or would like to know anything else about them, feel free to leave those comments in this video or in the other videos where I actually show using them, and I'll try to answer those. But hopefully this was useful or interesting if you were wondering about these tools. And yeah, thanks for watching.